Hi, I'm Jerry Kenny, and thanks for watching this edition of America's Survival TV on Roku. Tonight's topic, Saudi Arabia, friend or foe? President Obama says that he wants Congress to approve a war against ISIS, the Islamic State. But who funded ISIS? Vice President Joe Biden, during a speech at Harvard, blamed America's Sunni allies in the region.
Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad.
Biden said these policies ended up helping the militants linked to al-Qaeda and ultimately ISIS. So how can Saudi Arabia now be a U.S. ally against ISIS? Well, with that question, we'll go to Cliff Kincaid in Washington, D.C. for our program.
Jerry, thanks a lot. We've got a great program tonight because we are going to take a hard look at Saudi Arabia. Friend or foe. Now, I've made up my mind, but we're going to lay out the evidence for you to consider. The fact is that Saudi Arabia, as we all know, we should know by now, produced 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11. Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, was a Saudi citizen. Saudi Arabia had financed al-Qaeda. And now, as we just heard, as Jerry related, quoting Joe Biden, Saudi Arabia was involved in financing the rise of this al-Qaeda spinoff called ISIS, or the Islamic State. Now, Joe Biden, after he made those comments at Harvard, had to apologize. Oh, he didn't really mean it, and he had to apologize to the Turks, the Emirates, and the Saudis. But the fact is that Saudi Arabia is neck deep in this whole mess, the rise of global jihad. And we're very honored tonight to have as our guest Deborah Weiss. We're going to talk to Deborah about her chapter in this book that deals with the organization of the Islamic Conference. It's titled Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network. And this is a book, by the way, take a look at that. That is the Saudi Arabian flag. And according to my translation, it means, quote, "There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God, and the sword is supposed to stand for the house of Saud." But of course, it's a peaceful religion. We're going to talk about that with Deborah and also go into some more detail about some of the Sunni Islamic groups that Saudi Arabia has been funding over the years. And we're going to focus in particular on one particular member of the royal family, a Saudi prince by the name of Alwaleed bin Talal. Now, if you're familiar with what we've been doing at America's Survival and what we've talked about on this show, you know that we've focused a lot of attention on Saudi Prince Alwaleed. He happens to be the leading foreign investor in the United States, and he advertises that fact. He's a major investor in the parent company of Fox News. He invests in companies like Citibank and Twitter. I mean, he is a big player in the United States. And what's fascinating about this guy is that recently he was in the news because the 20th hijacker, they call him that, Zacarias Moussaoui, who was captured before 9/11 and who was later convicted and is sentenced to prison, a federal prison, recently gave a deposition, a sworn statement to some lawyers for the families of the 9/11 victims who were suing Saudi Arabia over the Saudi role in 9/11. And Moussaoui in that sworn statement said that Saudi Prince Alwaleed bin Talal and two other top Saudis had been financiers of al-Qaeda before 9/11. Now, the Saudi regime is saying, oh, that's just a bunch of nonsense. Moussaoui is a lunatic. You can't take him seriously. But one of the lawyers, and I've written a whole column on this, his name is Sean Carter. He recently gave an interview to Michael Smerconish on CNN in which he said they went into that deposition with Moussaoui, that sworn statement, and they had some counterterrorism experts there who went over everything that Moussaoui had told them about the role of the Saudis, what al-Qaeda was up to before 9/11, how they organized for the attacks. And Sean Carter said they checked, double-checked, cross-checked that information, and they found Moussaoui to be credible. Now, this is very, very serious and brings back to the fore the Saudi role in 9/11. And keep in mind, even at this late date, there are still 28 pages of the original congressional report on 9/11 dealing with the Saudi role that have been classified, not released to the American people. And Smerconish and some others, myself included, have said, let's release those 28 pages. Former Senator Bob Graham of Florida, who was a co-chair of the committee that produced that report, says those censored, classified 28 pages do deal with the Saudi role in 9/11, perhaps even naming some of the Saudis involved in financing al-Qaeda before the attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans on that fateful day. So this is very critical because I'm going to return to the subject of Saudi Prince Alwaleed. He's not only the leading foreign investor in the United States, he also invests in America's colleges and universities, and we'll get into that. He also invested at least $500,000 in a Muslim Brotherhood front group called the Council on American-Islamic Relations, known as CARE. And our guest, Deborah Weiss, was the primary writer and researcher for this book. It's on the Council on American-Islamic Relations, its use of lawfare and intimidation. So we're going to get into this and a lot more. Deborah, thanks for coming on the show with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Deborah, when you heard about the Zacarias Moussaoui allegations dealing with top Saudis, including Alwaleed bin Talal, allegedly being involved in financing al-Qaeda, did that come as a surprise or a shock to you?
No, actually, what came as a surprise to me is that there are still people in this country that believe that the Saudi family had nothing to do with al-Qaeda or the 9/11 attacks.
And so give us your background in terms of how you came to this whole subject. I know you're a 9/11 survivor. That certainly has to motivate your interest in all of this. But you've gotten to be one of the top researchers in the country on the global jihad movement. Can you bring us up to speed about, in a summary way, the Saudi role in all of this and how they've gotten away with a major cover-up about that role all these years?
Sure. Well, as you said, Zacarias Moussaoui is referred to as the 20th hijacker. As we know, there really were only 19 hijackers, but he was convicted of conspiracy to commit terrorism and is behind bars in a life sentence. And he's made claims recently saying that Saudi royal family members have donated to al-Qaeda and were involved in 9/11. He says that Prince Turk al-Faisal actually paid him to train the 19 hijackers, and that he also financed the other terrorists as well. The royal family denies this, but in addition to the fact, Cliff, that you pointed out, the 28 pages, I think you said it was in a House and Senate report, correct? That there were also redacted pages in the 9/11 Commission report regarding the Saudis, I think it's clear that the Bush administration allowed some of the Saudis to leave without being questioned. And let me put it to you this way. There is, whether you want to say that the Saudis are funding direct suicide attacks and bombings, or whether they're just fueling the ideology from which the suicide bombers take their directives, either way, they're making a huge contribution to it. What is the number one export of Saudi Arabia? Some people will say it's oil, but it isn't. It's Wahhabi ideology, and they spent over $70 billion between 1975 and 2002 to spread that ideology around the globe. It is the dominant ideology even in American mosques today. Now, I am not saying that all people who identify themselves as Muslim adhere to this ideology or want to live under Sharia law, but that doesn't change the fact that the Saudis are doing everything they can to spread that ideology, and what we're doing is we're pretending that they're friends with us, when really the chickens come home to roost when their ideology comes to bite us in the back. I believe the reason we're doing this is because in the 1970s, we made a deal with them to get cheap oil. And that's what the whole thing is all about, you know? So we would rather have cheap oil, and we just turn a blind eye to everything they're doing. But the fact is, you know, they're not our friends. And if you just look at what kind of country they are and the kind of values they have, under the new Saudi monarch that just took office, we had another beheading. This is 2015, and that wasn't in violation of the law. That was in compliance with the laws there. Today, in 2015, women cannot drive. They cannot go outside without a male escort. And by the way, women can't even get medically required surgery without written permission from a male relative. So to think that a government that implements values like that can work together with the freest country in the world, I think is laughable. And the last thing I'll say about it is, I'm sure you remember this, after 9/11, Prince Alwaleed offered Giuliani a $10 million check to help cover some of the costs of the destruction. And he rightly turned it down because Prince Alwaleed was saying that the reason this attack was committed was because of U.S. foreign policy, including support for Israel and the foreign troops that are based in Saudi Arabia. So I think it was very courageous of him to do that. You look around the political landscape today, and I don't think there are a lot of politicians who take a stand like that. A lot of them are about the money, unfortunately.
We're talking, ladies and gentlemen, to Deborah Weiss. She's an attorney herself, who has contributed a chapter to the book Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network. And by the way, Deborah's going to be a featured speaker at our upcoming February 24th news conference in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. The title of the news conference is America's Enemies Then and Now. We're going to look at how the communists manipulated Hollywood based on a new book written by my old friend Alan Riskin called Hollywood Traitors. But we're also going to bring it up to date with Deborah by looking at the ability of the Muslim interest groups, specifically the Council on American-Islamic Relations, to manipulate what's coming out of Hollywood today to benefit the global Jihad movement. And I mentioned, Deborah, that you were the primary writer and researcher for this book, an excellent book on the Council on American-Islamic Relations. The subtitle is Its Use of Lawfare and Intimidation. And I mentioned Alwaleed had given them, this was back in 2002, a grant of $500,000. And here we're dealing with their influence operations in the United States. Give our viewers, if you would please, a little hint of what you've discovered about CARE's operations in the United States and in Hollywood, and what you might be talking about on February 24th.
Right. Well, on February 24th, since the theme of the panel is Hollywood's enemies, I will be focusing on CARE's influence over Hollywood films and media. But what I found in the larger picture is CARE has influence operations in many aspects of American society. First of all, they spawned out of Islamic Palestinian Jihad and Hamas. They're basically the propaganda wing of Hamas. So they engage in what I'll just call nonviolent. I don't even know how to word it. They want an Islamic caliphate and they want Sharia law, but they're doing it incrementally, sometimes mostly legally. And their three goals, which I can derive based on my research, is to Islamize the workplace, to stifle all criticism of anything related to Islam, and to hamper national security. So one of their main things that they do is try to shut people up when they're revealing the truth of whether it's the truth about the underlying ideology of Islamic terrorist groups, or the truth about CARE, or just the truth about acknowledging the fact that there is such a thing as Islamic terrorism. So they want to dissociate the idea, any version of Islam, with terrorism entirely. And they do this not just by trying to shut down speakers, trying to make sure books aren't published, articles aren't published. They also have pressured producers to alter film scripts, to get TV shows canceled. And they also have been quite active coercing corporations to change their products, their package designs, and even their own internal production procedures so that they don't offend Islam. And I'll give you one example, if I may.
Sure.
In 1996, Nike came out with what was then a new sneaker called Nike Air. And a Muslim saw the logo for the word Air and thought it looked sort of like the word Allah in Arabic. When CARE found out about this, it complained to Nike and asked them to change the logo and actually to remove all the sneakers that were already on the shelves. The product had been launched, and originally Nike refused to capitulate. But in the end, there was quite a bit of pressure. CARE threatened to not just boycott the product, which I think is a fair thing to do. You know, that's the free market. If you don't want a product, don't buy it. But they had a huge Middle East market, and they threatened to boycott the entire company, which would basically wind up closing the company down. So in the end, Nike capitulated. They made a public apology to all Muslims. They yanked the product from the shelf and ate the costs to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. They changed the design logo, and they consulted with CARE when they did it. They changed their internal production procedures forward-looking to make sure that in the future they don't offend Muslims. And they wound up donating tens of thousands of dollars to mosques, to Islamic charities, to Dar al-Hijra mosque out in Virginia, which is considered a radical mosque. And that is just one example of a multitude of examples that I have. They've pressured clothing designers. The names are corporate names that you're familiar with: Heinz, Disney, DKNY Jeans, Chanel. It just goes on and on and on. And nobody really was connecting the dots. So you have an isolated incident here, an isolated incident there. And that's basically what that book is it connects the dots by category. And they've also they also filed a lot of lawsuits against people who said things that they didn't like. The claim was usually that somebody or something was defamed. And they really never would win. A lot of times they didn't expect to win. The goal was to bleed the other side dry, to intimidate people, and to shut them up. So
it's an amazing story. This CARE does use these tactics of, as you put it in the book on the title here, Lawfare and Intimidation. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Deborah Weiss, She contributed a chapter to the book Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network, and was the primary writer and researcher for this book. We're just talking about the Council on American-Islamic Relations, its use of lawfare and intimidation. I'm going to be going to my co-host, Jerry Kenny, in a minute. But this is a call-in show. If you want to call in, we can take your calls. Let me give you out that number. It's a toll-free number, 855-487-2123. Take down this number. You can call in right now, and we'll get you on the air, 855-487-2123. Now, before we go to Jerry, Deborah, I wanted to ask you about this charge that's labeled on a national or even a global basis, as you write about in your chapter in that book on Saudi Arabia, this charge of Islamophobia. Now, I found myself on one of these lists of so-called
Congratulations.
Islamophobic individuals singled out by CARE. And of course, the implication is that I have some kind of phobia about Muslims. I guess that I'm scared of them, I fear them irrationally. Tell us a little bit about where this charge originated and the role on a global basis of this group, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, comes in.
Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked about Islamophobia. You are correct. As someone with a degree in psychology also, obviously, a phobia is an irrational fear. So technically, it's saying that it's somebody who has an irrational fear of Islam or Muslims. Although I can tell you as a 9/11 survivor that if you weren't afraid and running for your life, that would have been irrational. Really, they use it in the sense to connote bigotry or prejudice, which is a prejudgment. But the truth is, a lot of us have a post-judgment, having seen or experienced the terrorist attacks, having been victim to the pressure to stifle our freedom of speech. So it was a term that was coined by the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is a Muslim think tank here in Virginia. And it's basically designed to stifle all debate about the Islamic ideology. And for those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with anything to do with Islam, it's very different than Christianity or Judaism or other religions. Other religions really are restricted to the spiritual sphere, whereas Islam, in its full-blown expression, it includes a judicial system, an economic system, an educational system, a financial system. So it's really a political, theological, economic, it's a whole way of life. They don't have separation of mosque and state. Now, that is not to say that there are no people who identify themselves as Muslim who would like to practice their religion within the confines of the Constitution, but they're limited. They can only do what the Constitution allows. And a lot of what's full-blown Sharia law would not be allowed within the United States constitutional framework. So the word Islamophobia, a lot of mostly liberals, but I guess anybody who chooses or doesn't have the time or interest to explore who's levying those charges, assume that the charge is of bigotry. And they lump it together with racism, sexism, homophobia, and that kind of thing. But the truth is that the application of the word by Islamist groups like CARE and the OIC, it is used to stifle the debate on very legitimate issues of concern, like Islamic terrorism, the Islamic persecution of Christians in Middle East countries, and human rights violations committed in the name of Islam. In fact, Cliff, if you criticize any of those ideas, if you criticize the amputations of people who steal, or the stoning of women who are raped but are accused of adultery, if you question the forced marriages of little girls, all of that is considered quote unquote defamation of Islam. It's prohibited to even criticize or raise a discussion about it in some of the Islamic countries. And in their definition of Islamophobia. It's anybody who defames Islam. So if you raise concerns about Islamic terrorism, you are an Islamophobe, and that is the purpose of the word. So do you want me to talk to you a little bit about the OIC?
Let's hold on to that.
Okay.
We'll get into that. I want to turn it over to Jerry. I know Jerry has some questions, and again, we can open it up. Our phone number 855-487-2123. Jerry.
Yeah, Deborah, I've been involved in Florida here and had a couple of encounters with the organization CARE. And, when you talk about how they want to stifle debate, they clearly do. But what has concerned me the most is not so much CARE as it has been the people who are very well intended, let's say, for example, conservatives or the Tea Party types that have actually played right into the hand of CARE. That they have I don't think that they really understand how very clever the whole pitch is that comes from CARE and how they lay traps for people. For example, we had a situation with a school book down here that was clearly candy coating Islam. It didn't candy coat the other religions, but it candy coated Islam. And we had a guy who was one of the activists who got on television and said, well, until we can get this textbook straightened out, we need to have the school board tear those pages right out of the school book. Well, now you're a book burner, and so have you? Do you feel that there's really a need for people who have a concern about the Islamization of America, that they do their homework and really understand the nature of what we're up against?
Absolutely, Jerry. People in this country live in a bubble. We have the Constitution, we have separation of powers and checks and balances, and so far we've been fortunate in that many American Muslims have assimilated. Although it's getting to be, we have more and more numbers of Muslims under this administration coming in, for example, as refugees, Somali Muslims coming into parts of the Bible Belt, and they're not assimilating. And in those areas, we're having all kinds of problems. If you want to know what our country is facing, all you have to do is look at Europe. Europe is in dire straits. Look what happened with Charlie Hebdo. Look what happened in the UK when there was the beheading of a soldier in the middle of the street in broad daylight. Look at what's happening with the no-go zones, and yes, there are no-go zones in France. And look what's happening in other areas of Europe where during Friday prayers, they line the streets, even though there are zoning laws against it, and the police just stand idly by and watch. So Europe is further progressed or degressed, however you want to look at it, in terms of the Islamization of Europe, but we're not far behind. We are not immune. And if we want to stay free, we have to be vigilant. We have to educate ourselves, educate your family, your children, your coworkers, your neighbors. And I understand that most people are busy. They just want to go to work, raise their family, send their kids to school, and they might not have the time or the inclination to dedicate themselves full time to the cause the way I do. But I think it's incumbent upon every American to at least do something to inform their family and their children so that they can hold their elected officials accountable, and they know what their officials stand for, and they know who to vote for based on that. It is not a foregone conclusion that freedom will be permanent in America. It was fought for with blood, sweat, and tears, and it can be lost at any moment. And once it's lost, we're never going to get it back. The fact that there are Islamist groups who are infiltrating, who are providing propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, and trying to fog the war and blind the public as to what their goals really are. They don't have to be violent. These groups like CARE, Muslim Students Association, Islamic Society of North America, all have the same goal as Al-Qaeda or as ISIS. They want an Islamic caliphate, and they want worldwide Sharia law.
Deborah,
it might sound crazy when you're living in the suburbs and driving your kid to school, but it's not. It doesn't have to happen overnight. it can happen slowly, gradually, and incrementally. So you better wake up and pay attention.
Okay, well, picking up on that thought, if I could just follow up, are we becoming desensitized to this stuff in the West? I mean, you know, we started out with losing 3,000 Americans on 9/11, fought a couple of wars over this thing. Now we're trying to pretend that it never happened in some circles. And then we see around the world, for example, in Canada, where they experience a little bit of it. Then we have, as you say, what's happening in Europe. But it doesn't seem as though we're really doing anything about it. We can't even get our own government to get in gear. And now they've found out that why beheading people isn't enough. Now they need to light them on fire. And what is it going to take to get our attention here in the West?
You know, that's a good question. I can't speak to other people. I speak around the country and just try to sound the alarm and explain that this is not a war that's happening over there. It's not a war that doesn't impact them. And it isn't always even a war that manifests itself in violence. You know, if you can't talk about things, you know, if you are denied your freedom of speech, which is a fundamental human right, we are in trouble. And, you know, I was a little surprised to hear you say, Jerry, that there were Tea Party people who were in cahoots with CARE or somehow making excuses for them. I believe you if you say that.
No, Deborah. What I was saying is that there was a Tea Party type person who thought he was being helpful, but he was going about it all the wrong way. What he did was he said, I mean, his heart was in the right place, and they understood what, but they played right into the hands of CARE because they said, well, until we get this situation resolved, let's tear the pages out of the textbooks. And so the Tea Party person came across as being a book burner rather than if they would have done their homework. But they definitely were opposed.
Let me ask Deborah, in a case like that, if you're a citizen, a parent, you got kids in the schools, and he or she brings home a history book, and you find, as Jerry said in that case, that they sugarcoat or candy coat Islam, making it out to be a peaceful religion. As a parent, what should you do in a case like that, Deborah?
Well, first of all, you should try to prevent it. Get on the school boards, join your PTA, know what your children are learning. You have to try to make sure that the books that they're getting are accurate, because history is being rewritten as we sit here. So that's first of all. You have to know who's on the school boards. You don't want to have CARE representatives who are taking over your children's brains and minds and soul because you're not paying attention and you're going to work. So I think you have to just really, starting when they're at a young age, be involved with your children, know what they're being taught. Try to find out what's going on in the schools. In a lot of public schools, CARE is giving quote unquote training seminars to teachers. Now, this is not an official program that's part of the governments. The governments haven't provided it, but they do it separate, like an extracurricular activity, and teachers can get some kind of credit, like continuing legal education credit. I don't want to say the wrong thing because I don't know exactly what it is they get, but I know they get the training seminars outside of the government, and they have some kind of incentive to do it. But, you shouldn't just lie down and let them get away with it.
Well, if I could just follow up just one other comment, and that is that I don't know if I'm the only person that feels this way, but I am really sick to death of hearing people on television who claim to be anchor types or reporters that talk about how long we in America have been involved in these wars against radical Islam. Well, by golly, we've been involved in this longest war in the history of America. Why, we've been involved in this thing for 10 years. But anyone that takes the time to understand the history of jihad in the West knows these people have been at this for 1,300 years. And I just wonder, is there really a sense of commitment? And do people, are we starting to understand now, Deborah? Do you think that maybe this is going to be a long haul kind of a thing, or are we looking for quickie little wars?
Well, we definitely live in a microwave society here in the West, and especially in America. We're not used to feeling uncomfortable. Get a headache, take an aspirin, you're hungry, you microwave it. We don't have a lot of patience. So for those who say that, we've been fighting too long, it's been 10 years, I'm sure those in the Middle East are laughing. 10 years is nothing to them. They think in terms of centuries. They're thinking in terms of not even in their lifetime. So it's definitely a long war. It's also a war of ideas. 85% of the war is ideological in nature. It's not all about bombs and missiles or even suicide bombers. Violence is one tactic for them to achieve their goals, but there are other tactics that the Muslim Brotherhood front groups use, whether it's legislation or infiltration, filing lawsuits. There's a myriad of tactics, a lot of which I talk about in that book. And going back to what you were saying before, Jerry, I think, unfortunately, there's been what David Horowitz refers to as an unholy alliance between the left and Islamist groups. The most unlikely leftist groups seem to align with organizations like CARE. You'll get feminist groups or gay groups or these leftist groups and those leftist groups, and it makes no sense. For example, this is a slightly not exactly analogous, but there's actually an organization called Queers for Palestine. Queers for Palestine, in Palestine, they might be for Palestine, but the Palestinians aren't for them. They get killed over there. They get murdered. So it's the same kind of thing. It doesn't make any sense. If these groups had ultimately what their long-term goals are, gays would be hung in the public square the way they are in Iran. Women would be relegated to the back of the house the way they are in Saudi Arabia. The list just goes on and on. So it's baffling as to why they align. And I think the best explanation that I can think of is that they have an anti-American bent, and that's their common bond. They hate America and they hate Israel. So under the theory of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, they've formed an alliance to destroy America from within, and they'll fight the rest out later. But I do believe that, unfortunately, I used to try to be nonpartisan when I did my presentations. I can't do it anymore. Under this administration, it's been such an awful pattern of siding with Islamists, whether it's foreign policy, national security, having the State Department meet with members of the Muslim Brotherhood who are actually outlawed in the country they're from, in Egypt, or his comments the other night that we're worrying too much about terrorism and that we should worry more about climate change, and the boredom with which he expressed his comments about the man who was emulated in a cage. It's just really outstanding. So I'm kind of speechless on it, I think, until we get the next administration. And I'm not really hanging my hopes too high in that either. And we have to be really vigilant and push on this issue, because President Obama next week is having a countering violent extremism summit. It's supposed to be in response to the Hebdo murders, and specifically to the Hebdo murders and some of the murders, the Islamic murders that have been going on in Europe. And yet, he can't call it what it is. It's countering violent extremism, and he repeatedly refers to it as like it's a crime instead of a war, just sort of like a common thug down the block who broke into someone's home. Second, like it's random acts of violence. Third, for example, denying that the target of the kosher cafe was because they were Jewish, and purposely purging anything to do with Islam from it, even though they're screaming Allahu Akbar and saying, we've avenged our prophet. So it's really, in fact, part of that program that he's having next week, nothing on the agenda even mentions Islamic terrorism or Islamist ideology. It actually says that part of the program, they're going to hook up political leadership with Muslim leadership in the community. And I'm like, what? That's probably, you can translate that as CARE and other Muslim Brotherhood front groups. So it's going exactly in the wrong direction. And there's no question that a large part of the reason is this administration is actually getting their advice from Muslim Brotherhood front groups. So, it's siding with the enemy. They're getting advice from the wrong people.
And that's why, Deborah and Jerry, I'm so dubious about this administration push for congressional authorization, supposedly to fight ISIS or the Islamic State, with Saudi Arabia as our ally. when Saudi Arabia is responsible for so much of this, as Deborah has talked about. I think we should turn the tables on this administration. The Congress ought to hold hearings into some of the things we've talked about, the activities of CARE, the Muslim Brotherhood here and abroad, and especially the role of Saudi Arabia in financing the global jihad. In particular, let's bring somebody like Saudi Prince Alwaleed to Washington, not to make another business deal. And by the way, he is a major investor in the parent company of Fox News, which is 21st Century Fox. He's a major investor in Time Warner, which is the parent company of CNN. I mentioned some of these earlier. Citibank, Twitter, I can go down the list. Let's not bring him over here as he usually comes over, and then he gets on Fox News and is referred to as His Royal Highness. But bring him, subpoena him, bring him before a congressional committee, and let's ask him to respond specifically to the allegations of Zacarias Moussaoui that he is a financier of al-Qaeda. Let's look at the books. Let's declassify the 28 pages. Let's get to the bottom of this before we get into another war in which we're being played as suckers. And that's how it looks to me. Now, let me mention before we go into more questions here that Deborah's going to be one of our featured speakers on February 24th in Washington, D.C. Our news conference is titled America's Enemies in Hollywood Then and Now. And go to my website, usasurvival.org, for more information about this news conference. That's usasurvival.org. And I'm not going to preempt what Deborah has to say, but let me just give you one example that I've written about in the past in terms of CARE and its influence in Hollywood. It was years ago that Hollywood was going to do a movie based on the Tom Clancy book, The Sum of All Fears, about Arab terrorists detonating a nuclear bomb. And that was the theme of the Tom Clancy book. But when it became a Hollywood movie, under pressure from this Muslim Brotherhood front CARE, the villains were changed into neo-Nazis so as not to offend CARE and their supporters. This is the kind of thing, ladies and gentlemen, that's going on in Hollywood. Again, it's as serious, in my opinion, as how they're sanitizing the textbooks and trying to influence through other means in other venues. But they are active in Hollywood, and this is one of the things we're going to look at on at our February 24th news conference in Washington, D.C. Now, before we go, I did want to give you a chance, Deborah, to talk about this group that you write about in your chapter in this book, Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. You've mentioned some of their efforts on Islamophobia, but many people may not be aware of how important this group is. I understand it's the major multinational interest group at the UN itself.
That's true. And it's amazing that most people have never heard of it. It is the second largest international organization in the world, behind only the UN. It's the largest Islamic organization in the world, claiming to represent 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. It has a stranglehold on the UN Human Rights Council, which is part of the reason that council is a farce and nothing gets done there. And it's arguably the largest voting bloc in the UN as a whole. So their goal, they hold themselves out as moderate, but as I said previously, their ultimate goal is to have an Islamic caliphate and worldwide Sharia law. So on the top of its priority list is to criminalize all speech that's critical of Islam or that sheds anything to do with Islam in a negative light. So in Muslim countries, all the Muslim countries have some sort of blasphemy laws, whether they're codified or informal and varying degrees, varying punishments. But the OIC's target is the West. It seeks to stifle all speech that's related to Islam, and that serves two purposes. One is it forces non-Muslims to submit to their religion by submitting to Sharia blasphemy laws, even when they're not Muslim. Why should they have to submit to those rules? And second is it creates a safe space for jihadists to pursue their goals. If you can't acknowledge the existence of Islamic terrorism and you are unfamiliar with Islamist ideology, then you cannot identify the enemy in its early stages, and you can't come up with a strategy to defeat it. So what they do is they've drafted and gotten passed year in and year out since 1999 UN resolutions that would have the effect of clamping down on that speech. UN resolutions are not legally binding, but they still carry a lot of political clout and run the risk of being deemed customary international law if they're passed repeatedly. In 2011, they passed an alternative bill at the urging of our State Department called Resolution 1618. And the West believed incorrectly that the OIC was finally dropping its mission to prevent quote unquote defamation of Islam and instead was focusing on protecting religious minorities. But to make a long story short, they still found a way to interpret the language to have the same meaning and to protect Islam from defamation. So I want to say that in America, we don't have an idea like that. In America, the concept of defamation is only applied to people. In fact, in all of the West, it's only applied to people. If you make a false statement of fact, then you can be sued for defamation under certain circumstances. But if you make a comment that's negative and it's accurate, or if you merely express your opinion, that is constitutionally protected speech. In the OIC's concept of defamation, what it does is it's giving an idea legal protection from criticism. They're basically saying that the ideology of Islam is off the table for scrutiny or criticism, that it cannot be touched, it cannot be analyzed, and it cannot be looked at. This is a very dangerous idea because free speech is a human right. It's not just a right in and of itself. It's what we call an empowering right. It's a right from which other rights flow. It's a foundational freedom, and without it, there are no other freedoms. Not only that, but words represent ideas. The purpose of language is so that we can communicate our thoughts amongst each other. So in their attempts to stifle the speech, what they're really trying to do is to also stop the thoughts. It's a thought-stopping measure. If you don't have the language to acknowledge it, the idea kind of goes away. And they're doing this on purpose because they don't want you to know what they're doing. The same groups that are alleging there's no such thing as Islamic terrorism are the exact same groups that are supporting it. So that's who the OIC is. And I just want to say that it's very, very important. Sun Tzu was a very well-known military general, Chinese military general, and wrote a very famous treatise called The Art of War. And in it, he said that in order to win a war, we have to know our enemy and know ourselves. And my concern is we have forgotten both. We have to be able to name the ideological threat, and until we can elect people and support them in having as a priority freedom over low gas prices, we're really not going to get to the bottom of this, and we're still going to be playing patsy with Saudi Arabia and pretending they're our friends while they're flying planes into buildings.
Deborah, thanks a million for spending all this time with us. And ladies and gentlemen, again, I want to reiterate, we're going to have a news conference dealing with the subject of Hollywood in particular on February 24th in Washington, D.C. It's free and open to the public. Go to our website for more information. That news conference, by the way, is 2 days after the Academy Awards are being held and the Oscars are given out. Now, one of the big films that's up for an Oscar is, of course, American Sniper. We'll see what happens. That film is certainly striking a chord with the American people who are and this is a good example. This is a Clint Eastwood film of some positive a positive role that Hollywood can play. But of course, this is a very unique case, that of American Sniper. Whether it gets an Oscar or not, the other side, the radical Islamists, will continue to exercise a lot of influence in Hollywood. That's what we're going to be talking about on the 24th in Washington, D.C. Deborah Weiss is going to be our speaker on that topic. We're also going to feature Alan Riskin, who's written the book Hollywood Traitors, looking back on Stalin's agents of influence in Hollywood during the 1940s and 50s. And our final speaker is going to be my good friend, my old friend Trevor Loudon, of the famous blogger who has broken so many stories about scandals in the Obama administration. Again, all of us are going to be in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club on February 24th, 2 days after the Oscars are given out, to talk about Hollywood then and now. We call it America's Enemies in Hollywood then and now. You don't want to miss this because it's really going to be critical to understand the role of Hollywood and the role they're playing in American society. We all like good movies, don't we? We all like to relax and be entertained, but we've got to be cognizant of the foreign interests, the special interest groups that are manipulating these films. And we're going to have a lot more on that at our news conference. So, Deborah, thanks again for spending this time with us. Jerry,
thank you for having me.
Well, that's our show for tonight. We'll see you again next Wednesday night at 9 o'clock live, right here on America's Survival TV on Roku. Thanks for watching.